Welcome to DejaVue.
Your favorite Vue podcast, you just don't know it yet. Or maybe do by now, maybe you have a little deja vu, you'll see. I am here, Alexander Lichter, web engineering consultant and Nuxt team member, also doing lots of content around Nuxt, Vue, JavaScript, TypeScript on YouTube, and every now and then blogging. And I'm here with Michael Thiessen. Hey, Michael.
Hey, how's it going? So I am a full-time Vue content creator and educator. So I'm, out here creating all sorts of things to help you learn more about Vue and Nuxt and do all that kind of stuff. The instructor for the official course on Nuxt, Mastering Nuxt, among other things. Today, we're going to talk about VueUse, this wonderful library that comes with so many useful things, and so many things, in fact, that I am constantly forgetting that it exists and implementing my own versions and then realizing, oh, wait, it already exists. Why did I spend the time to do this?
Classic one. Yeah, VueUse, for everybody not knowing, have never heard of it, go to vueuse.org and check it out. It's basically, as Michael said, a library for all kinds of composables. Like, it's really crazy. So whenever you think like, hey, that could be like a cool custom functionality that's not included in Vue itself, there is a good chance VueUse might have an abstraction for that. And that ranges from wrapping like web APIs, like, use the battery of your device and check if it's low, or check if you're online, to, like, as I said, very like low level or abstracting things, all in Composables. And the best, it's also usable for Vue 3 and Vue 2, thanks to the Vue Demi library, which means even if you're still using Vue 2 and a composition API there, you can use VueUse. There's nothing stopping you from that.
Yeah. So, Alex, how often do you use this library, and like what use cases do you find for it? Where do you find yourself reaching for these composables?
Yeah, so I think in most of my projects, I will use, or I have used VueUse. It's not like I install it by default nowadays. It's more like, okay, if I really need it, I'll install it. But as soon as I think my applications reach at least a medium size, I'm usually going for it. That's mainly because if you start interacting with things like the local storage, then it's really nice to have a composable dealing with interactivity, setting things by default. Or if you need anything with like scrolling, animations, and so on, that's also a real nice way to go there. And for example, for slides also, so I use SlideF, another amazing tool in the Vue ecosystem, which we maybe should do another episode about. And I use it there, because you can use Vue components in that amazing Markdown-based slide tool to generate a QR code for example, a link to the slides or to your YouTube channel. Even for that, you can use VueUse, and it's pretty amazing what the whole thing can do. And the best part, once again, it's fully tree shakeable. So if you just use one tiny thing out of these, I don't know, like 200 plus functions, then you only import the one thing and not all the rest.
I had no idea that there was a QR code one in here. I might have to use that myself. And using it in SlideDev, that's a great idea for adding, there's a whole bunch of animation utilities and things like that. So I'm sure that there's some fun stuff you could do with that.
Definitely, yeah. And how do you use VueUse? Do you use it often? Do you use it in lots of projects?
I think that I end up using it like most of the time. I tend to forget about, like I mentioned, I forget that there are these things that exist. And I guess I'm just so used to implementing things myself, whether that's just like a preference of, I don't know, I can implement my own debounce function. And so, then I just end up doing that. I don't know. Maybe it's a bad habit that I should break and just start using these libraries off the shelf and not constantly re-implement all these things.
Yeah, well, I think it has merit in both, right? I think, especially as we are in the JavaScript ecosystem, people are very, like, in a way, it's very common to say, oh yeah, I just need a library to implement that one tiny function. I just want to mention the good old is-even package or the is-odd package, and one depends on another.
I was going to mention that too.
Fun, yeah. These are the scenarios where, like, do you really need a package for that? And also it's a lot about owning the implementation, because if you write your demounce function, then you can, well, adapt it as you want, and you're not relying on, oh, there's a major change in the library now. What now? Do I have to fork it? Do I have to copy the code? Do I have to not update it? But of course, on the other hand, it also means owning implementation means you would have to test it. You would have to make sure it works as you want. And it's a bit more, let's say, burden or effort. While, for example, Vueuse, it's like nicely tested. People use it. So it's in a way like pretty battle proven. But I think in the end, that's a trade-off one has to decide for each case. I mean, I don't know when I reached last time for Lodash for like utilities, because you can do most of the things just in JavaScript.
I think one of the things with VueUse is that there's that additional layer of reactivity as well. So like compared to something like Lodash, where a lot of these composables aren't necessarily that complicated, like using local storage, for example. It's not that difficult to use, but then adding that layer of reactivity then adds another complicated step. Sometimes you might hook it up wrong, and there's another opportunity for bugs. But then there are composables like this use QR code where I wouldn't even know where to begin with generating a QR code. Or like I was just noticing there's one here using clipboard. The clipboard has been, it's notorious for being difficult to use and all of that. So some of these are really nice to have like a little nice abstraction for it. You don't have to worry about how clipboard works or how QR code generation works. You just, use this nice little composable and away you go.
Absolutely. And the best part is, I think, if you want to know how it works. So first of all, the documentation is amazing. So you can have a look. They have a demo for each of these composables. So you can actually test them right away on the fly. You can see what they can be used for. And they're usually also interactive. So you can, for example, for the QR code one, really see what's happening when you change the text of the URL, then the QR code will change on the fly. You have the type definition there. And of course, also very important, a link to the source. So if you're really interested in, okay, how does it work under the hood? You can jump into the GitHub code, read through it, and also learn a lot.
Yeah, I have learned a lot of things from the VueUse source code. I don't know what it is about this project in particular, but I've noticed a bunch of other people have mentioned this as well, that they've learned some interesting techniques and stuff. I think they always link directly from the docs into the source code. So that's maybe one thing. It's also like really nicely self-contained, all of these composables for the most part. So you don't have to like dig through all these dependencies and like figure out, oh, where did this get called and where does this get called? So it's easy to read and learn and figure out these different things. And so, yeah, a couple of years ago, I wrote a series for Vue Mastery, which they later turned into some courses on different like patterns that I learned just from reading through the source code and seeing, oh, this is some interesting stuff that they've done with their composables. And we might talk a bit more about that once we get into specific composables here.
We will for sure. Yes, and I totally agree there. I even think from two sides, like as in writing JavaScript code, it's super interesting sometimes, and also how to like write nice composables. So for everybody writing their own composables, being extracted ones, inline ones, no matter what, even there, like there is a documentation page called best practices or best practice. And they really document, okay, what all these composables have in common. What do they return? Do they use ref or reactive for it? Do they clean up side effects? Yes, they'll do. We'll also get into that in a bit, and so on, so on. So you have a really nice overview of how, first of all these composables should work, and ideally can also adapt that when writing own composables to, for example, not forget, oh yeah, I have to clean up the side effect that I created there with my custom logic. Or, okay, if there's a reactive argument, then the composable should also, if the reactive argument changes, do something, because that's why you're given a reactive argument. And in a way, I really value that consistency across the library, even for all these different use cases, and also the best practices they share with the community. So their own composables from the users using the library and then using them maybe in other composables will also be better.
Yeah. It is really nice to have that. So let's talk about some composables from the library. So we have this one, useEventListener. I'm just going to pull it up so I have it.
Yeah, sure. Go for it. Maybe in the meantime, I can tell a little bit about it. So, I mean, most of us have registered event listeners in their time, being either with like vanilla JavaScript or through the like add click, add mouse over and so on in Vue. And usually, if you don't do it through Vue, but manually, like vanilla style, then commonly people forget to deregister them or to unregister them. So to clean up the side effects, what we just learned about. And commonly, it might not be a big deal, but if you have a component that registers an event listener, it doesn't clean it up, and it's called like 100 or thousands or whatever times, that can lead to a memory leak on the client side, to a sluggish application, especially for like these internal big SPAs that are opened once and then closed maybe at the end of the shift or the day. So that's really not a good practice. And the best part is we don't have to worry about implementing that on our own, because the use event listener composable will do this for us. You can just define your event listener, how it should look like, and the cleanup, which is usually done in on before unmount or on unmounted, and that will just be done for you. So that's the beauty of it. No more boilerplate. And of course, you could also write it on your own, but there it works. It catches all the edge cases, and we're good.
Yeah, and I mean, I've made that mistake so many times before, where I mean, it's so easy to forget to clean up your event listeners and all of that. And so it's nice to have that all packaged up in a little thing here. And one interesting thing that you can do then is, because you've got this composable with reactivity, you can actually make these arguments reactive themselves. So if you use a template ref on in your template and you pass that in, when that element changes, then useEventListener will automatically switch things around for you. It'll unregister that previous event listener, then attach a new event listener to this new element. And so you don't even have to worry about managing all that logic. It's just going to keep things working for you.
Yeah, that's once again a great example of like, okay, if you have a reactive argument here, like a ref, then if the changes, the composable should react to that and do the cleanup and register the new event listener when the ref changes. So yeah, I think really good example. And especially if you didn't do much vanilla JavaScript, like, I mean, in our times when we started with JavaScript, we still had to do like a little bit of jQuery in there, probably a few like vanilla things. But people maybe never, I don't know, wrote a simple to-do list in vanilla JavaScript. They might not be aware that you should unregister event listeners at all, because sometimes the examples also just like, hey, this is how you add it, and that it works, and that's it, and that's the end because it works. So in a way, it also either avoids to go into exactly that trap and either forgetting it or not even being aware of it.
Yeah.
All right, then we have one more composable. Actually, let's just do two straight away because they fit so nicely together. useDebounce and useThrottle. Maybe before we get into these composables, Michael, can you explain the difference between a debounce and a throttle? Because at least to me, it's always something you check, you look up. Do you want the one thing or do you want another thing? Do you have a good explanation for that?
Yeah, so I'm gonna do my best. This is something that I find I'm always looking up, because I always get these messed up and mixed up in my head, and I'm like, which one is which? So debounce and throttle. So throttle is, you've got a bunch of events coming through, and you, for example, if you're doing like a search component, right? You're typing into a search bar, and you don't want to have a request hit your server every single keystroke, because that's a lot. Maybe it takes a couple seconds for that result to come back. So you want to slow these requests down. So throttle will slow those down, and only, it sort of like spaces them out, if I'm getting this correct. Whereas debounce will sort of, it'll only take the most recent event. Is that a good way of explaining that?
Yeah, I think so. Like I always imagine you have like for throttle, you have like a gate, and if you say like, okay, throttle it to 500 milliseconds, then the gate opens after 500 milliseconds, and the first request that comes through, okay, done, gate is closed after 500 milliseconds. Like every 500 milliseconds it opens again, lets one through. And with debounce, exactly the 500 millisecond, they would just reset every time you trigger the function, the request, whatever again. So it wouldn't, I don't know, if you have like 2 seconds, then it wouldn't let through 4 requests. But if you like type something again and again, just the last request, then after the 500 millisecond period is over, will be properly executed, which is, I think, really nice for a search bar, because as long as the user is typing, that's a pretty good experience. While throttle can also work there. Like both would work.
Yeah, and there is some subtlety in how they affect the user experience, and we're going to link to an article here in the show notes that you can use to check it out. It's one of these things that's hard to explain just by talking, and so yeah, you can check out some visual examples if you want to get a better grasp of those differences. But we do have some composables that allow us to do this. So we've got useDebounce function and useThrottle function. And so they're sort of like two sides of the same coin here, where you can pass in any function that you want and get a debounced function back or a throttled function back.
And that's it. That's the easiest part. Like you can just straight away go for it, wrap it around your function, and it will just work. And interestingly, I think, for example, for useThrottle function, there are some related parts of VueUse where this is, for example, used to implement it. So, for example, you can also have a throttled ref to only update the ref, for example, every 500 milliseconds instead of all the time. I also can have a debounced ref. So both are things you can also find in VueUse as like ref implementations with exactly these features. And I've also used it recently. You can also have a watch, which is debounced, for example. So same idea. Have a watch function that's not triggered every time things change, but a debounced one. And I think they all use like useThrottle function or useDebounce function under the hood, or at least they share common utilities on the lower level and can make things really easy, especially when you work with like scrolling animations, things that happen very, very often.
Yeah, there's a lot of cases like that where we want to, like, we've got a bunch of events that are happening, a bunch of user input, something like that, but we don't actually want to do anything like multiple times. Like we don't want to react to it that fast, and so we got to slow things down. And yeah, these functions are really useful for that, rate limiting. Yeah,
exactly.
On watchers and stuff. Yeah.
We don't want to fire all the requests to the backend, especially if they won't be relevant for the user anyway. Especially if they're like typing for each letter, you don't really want to see the results. You can't really process it anyway as a person.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is useLocalStorage. So we've got a couple related composables here around browser storage. So we can use them through the useStorage composable. However, one thing to note is that if you're using Nuxt, Nuxt has a useStorage composable. And so there's a little bit of a conflict there. And so when I'm using this composable, I'm usually using the useLocalStorage or useSessionStorage, which this useStorage composable sort of it's like an alias for those, and you can switch between based on an option in here.
Exactly. And that's important to note. So if you use Vueuse with Nuxt, which, well, I commonly do, you too, Michael, then you have a module you can just add, and all the Vueuse things will be also auto-imported, of course, only when used. And exactly then useStorage is not auto-imported. Same for useFetch, because Nuxt has own implementations for that. Which also same idea. I commonly use useLocalStorage. That's a bit more explicit. I only need the local storage most of the time. And then in there, as the name says, you can use values from a certain key of a local storage. But as it's a ref that will be returned, amongst other things, it is also a two-way binding. So you can use the ref, you get a value, you can set a default in the options if the user, for example, has no information in the local storage under that key. Then you get the default, and it will be automatically set in your local storage. And also, if you change the ref to say, okay, I want to update like a JWT token, some settings, then you just update the ref and it will be written. So once again, it's a very nice wrapper around the local storage to make things pretty easy and very idiomatic in the Vue reactive way. So less boilerplate code is once again a big win. And also it's way more clear.
And one thing that we forgot to mention about these composables is that not only do they add that layer of reactivity, but they also add those types for us.
Yes.
And so with local storage and session storage, it's stored as a string. And so otherwise you just get a string back, and that's not as useful if you are using TypeScript. So what useStorage will do is, let's say underneath, what it's doing is serializing that data for you. So we can go into a string and then back out so that you can save objects or numbers or other data types. You can write your own custom serializer if you've got different data types that you want to convert to a string in a special way. You've got this extra layer of things. So yeah, in a way, local storage is straightforward to use. There's a couple methods to get and retrieve the values, but these composables add that extra layer of type safety and reactivity and
Convenience.
serialization.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if you use classes, which is not super common in the Vue ecosystem, but it can happen as well. And you want to, for example, create a class from something from local storage, then like a serialization process, like a custom serializer. That's ideal. Also, the other way around, if you want to save it, then it would be nice to tell, okay, how can I save that as like a JSON object? And of course, for all the primitive types and objects and arrays, then the serializer, they will just kick in and see, oh yeah, it's an object structure. There will be an object, not just a string you have to then parse yourself with JSON parse or stringify. So yeah, big win. And once again, a layer of type safety, convenience, and a joy to work with. So whenever you have to do something with the local storage, and very important, then you also get and set an item. So you like to use that reactivity, then it's a good case. I commonly also just use the normal local storage API if I really say like, yeah, for example, I have that on my website. I have a little notification. If your browser language is set to German, then I tell like, hey, I also speak German. And for that, I don't use that composable, mainly because I don't need the reactivity. I just check once the person enters the page, the user is there. I just check in unmounted, like, hey, okay, is that set or not? And did the person click the notification away? That's where the local storage comes in. And if that's the case, I will not show it. And if the person didn't click it away, I will show it. So there's no reactivity needed, which is why you don't always need to use a composable. And it always applies to Vue in general. Like you have to figure out where you need reactivity and where it's not really needed.
Yeah, that's a good point. It adds an overhead, but I think most of the time that doesn't really matter, like the performance aspect of it, but it does. Having unnecessary reactivity, I think the biggest thing is that it makes it unclear of what's going on. If you have a ref that never actually updates reactively, then it can be a little bit confusing for someone else coming in, or, when you've come back to your code 3 months later and you're like, wait, why isn't this updating?
Yeah, what's happening here?
It's good to keep in mind that, yeah, you don't always need to have things be reactive. You don't always need composables. You can just use vanilla JavaScript from time to time.
Absolutely. The performance part, as you said, most of the time is minimal, though I've also seen projects where you have components, like tiny components, and they even said like, oh, I use a computed property, though it's not needed. And if these components are called like 10,000 times on the page, or like even 1,000 times, then that can make a big difference. Especially like data visualization can sometimes touch a topic, like charts is always a big thing. And like data grids where you need like to show thousands of entries. There, it's really a good way to optimize. But I also agree, like optimizing just for performance should always be done when it's necessary, not like prematurely, because that's not a good idea, as we all know. All right, then let's jump to the next composable, and it's called useMagicKeys. Michael, what can you tell us about useMagicKeys?
So this one is really interesting. It's a useful composable, but I think the thing for me is that it's also very interesting in how it's implemented. So useMagicKeys, basically what you can do is you can go to the composable and you destructure what keys you want. So it'll help you, instead of using an event listener and saying, okay, listen to the space bar and the enter key, and then run this function when those are hit. You can just use destructure and name the variables with the key names, if that makes sense. So you're not passing in any arguments to this composable. So how does it know that you're specifically looking for the spacebar and the enter key, and that it should update those reactively when when those keys are hit? And it's not listening to every possible combination of every possible key. It's doing something interesting with proxies. So I'm not sure if you can do key combinations at the same time, although you can use a computed to check for key combos. But what the proxy does is it intercepts when you do that get, which you do when you destructure it. You're basically accessing that property from the composable. So when you access the space property, for example, this proxy will read that and sort of intercept that and say, oh, you're looking for this space property. And it will then create a computed property internally, and then it knows to watch for that. And so it will then start to keep track of that value for you. And then if you keep going, then you can add on whatever keys you want, and it will keep track of that for you. And it will just dynamically create these listeners based on the properties that you're accessing from this object, instead of you passing in arguments. So a very interesting interface to make this composable work.
Okay, that's really cool. Also in terms of performance, that you don't have to listen for everything, but just for the keys you actually want to get. And with keys, of course, it's meant like pressing keys on the keyboard and then like reacting, for example, oh, if you press this key combination, like a little shortcut should be used. But I think two important notes here. Like first, VueUse, we said it's usable for Vue 2 and Vue 3. This also applies to useMagicKeys, but it's very important that IE11 is not supported because proxies are not supported in IE11. So if you use Vue 2, if you need to support IE11, well, our condolences, it's not that easy. Yeah. Then you can't use that composable, unfortunately, unless you drop IE or say like, hey, this function is only for non-IE users and modern browsers, which is probably not possible for you. The other thing, I think now that you're talking about it, so you basically use a proxy to register based on the name of the property, like sysset space. But then key combinations might also be possible if you don't destructure it. But say like you have like, I don't know, const keys equals useMagicKeys. And then you say my computer property, like const combination is keys. And then in square brackets, you have like control plus shift plus A or something like that. And then it should also be possible to listen through that through useMagicKeys, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's one way. I'm also looking through the docs here, and you can, when you're destructuring, if you use an underscore to connect the different keys. So if you wanted, for example, if you wanted like a shift A, you would have your variable named shift underscore A, and then it looks at that, will split based on that underscore, and it knows to look for the shift and the A key. And when both are pressed together, it'll trigger that for you.
Sweet. So yeah, I also remember in Vue 2 there was this like Vue global keys package, I think, from ancient times, it sounds like. And that VueUse Composable sounds like a really amazing replacement, especially also with performance kept in mind. So really lovely to see that. And if you ever, like, dear listeners, if you ever used one of the VueUse Composables, if you prefer one with like, hey, this is really something you should check out, then please write it in the comments, write it to us on Twitter, X, YouTube, wherever you want to, Mastodon as well. Hit us up, write us an email. We're really curious about your stories dear devs.
So we've got one last one here that I'd like to mention in terms of how like it has an interesting implementation. So we'll do this one as the last one. And it's called makeDestructurable. So this one's not technically a composable, but a utility function. And what it does is it takes an object or a series of values. It allows you to return a value that's both an object and an array. So it's kind of confusing. So if you want to destructure it as an object and have named properties, you can do that. But if you also want to destructure it as an array and just define your values like based on the position in the array, you can do that as well. I'm not 100% sure on what exact use cases you would need this for, but it is like an interesting thing that it does. And so how it actually works internally is that it uses object.assign, and basically you take an array and you assign extra properties to that array so that when you try to access those properties on that array, it works. So if we remember that an array is like actually an object in JavaScript, and the properties are just numbers most of the time, and we also have a length property on this array object, we can also add in arbitrary properties using object.assign or other things. And so then when you are using that object, when you destructure from it, even though it's technically an array, these extra properties do still exist on it. So you can destructure off of that.
God, so this sounds a lot like black magic in a way.
It does, yeah.
But that also means like you can technically make everything destructurable as either an array with the square brackets or as an object with the curly brackets, no matter what it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting. I also think Anthony, who probably was the creator of that Composable, right, wrote like a long blog post about why you want to do this, why it could be interesting. Also, the TypeScript support, which is pretty similar because you pretty simple because you can just add an ampersand to say like, hey, okay, it's the object way and the array way. So also for that, link in the show notes to see how the creational process is. But I never had a scenario where I thought, hey, that would be cool. But probably as an internal util to like say, okay, you can take an array, but also an object. And then we transform it somehow. It doesn't have to check for performance reasons what is what. Could be interesting. I'll definitely have to check out where it's ever used. I'm really curious.
Yeah, it's definitely one. It's hard to explain. I hope I did an okay job of it, but we'll link to it. You can also just find it on the VueUse docs if you look for makeDestructurable, and it's literally like 26 lines. That includes the like TypeScript types and all that stuff. So it's pretty small implementation for this utility, and it's interesting though. So I highly encourage you to look through that and learn a few things, even though they may not be all that useful.
Apparently, I just checked. Apparently, it is used in another function from VueUse, in a component function called create reusable template, where you enable to reuse part of the template in like a VF/VLs construct to not have to render it all again. So
okay,
that's very interesting to do and to see. Definitely also give that a look because wow, there's an actual use case for that. I'm even more amazed.
There you go.
Sweet. And of course, they're way more composables than the ones we just mentioned. Like, for example, use ref history is another interesting one where you basically have the history of a ref, nice for like undo and redo and checking, and so on, so on. There's a big list and also lots of integrations as the QR code integration as before with other packages, with RxJS, even if you want to structure data, and so on and so on. So definitely give the whole thing a look and read through the docs. Of course, we also have all the links in the description to the composables that we've mentioned.
Yeah, definitely go check out the docs and just read through. I don't even know how many there are in here. There's got to be like 100 of them.
I think there's even 200 plus or so. So okay, it's crazy.
There's even ones on doing math, so doing logic, an average, all sorts of stuff, projections, whatever you need to do. There's probably something in here for you.
Super interesting and nice to see. Yeah, also like this whenever, for example, some of the like ref logic. So that's really interesting. Like whenever that certain ref is true, or that a certain computer is true, then do something. Like there are really some really nice logical abstractions. But yeah, once again, look through it and let us know which are your favorite composables, utilities, and so on you use from VueUse.
So before we wrap up this episode, I do want to mention that I'm working on something special. I'm working on the Nuxt Tips collection, which is a book. It's going to have over 100 tips on all sorts of ways of using Nuxt, and it'll be sort of like a sequel to the Vue Tips collection books that I've put out previously. So I hope to have this done and released end of summer. Don't know exactly when that'll be, but I will be sure to let you know when that is.
Sweet. And of course, also we have a link. So in case the pre-order page is up already and there's a little discount code, we all have that in the show notes. Definitely check out the link there.
For
Nuxt
sure.
Tips collection with a little sweet discount for the beloved DejaVue listeners. And before we say goodbye, there is one more thing to say, because this is the last episode before we have a very, very special guest on board. So definitely stay tuned for next week's episode, where we have someone you definitely all know. I'm more than sure you do know that person on here. So stay tuned. Check out all the other older episodes. For example, last week's episode where we talked with Danny Rowe about the road to Nuxt 4, and all the other ones before, from server-side rendering over Nitro to Vue in general. We have lots of things covered, and there is more coming. So yeah, if this was your first episode, thanks for joining. If this was your 14th episode, then thanks so much for watching every single one. If there's anything in between, you know what to do. Catch up and talk to you next week.
Yeah, make sure to subscribe on whatever platform you're on. That really helps us out a lot.
Exactly.
And we hope to see you in the next one.
And don't forget the 5-star review. See you, folks.